Okay. Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to another of Social Farms and Gardens webinars. This is part of a series that we've been running on COVID-19 issues over the last month or so. And today's session is on reopening after lockdown, and we're going to be taking you through the checklist that my colleague Amber, who's here, has developed working with other colleagues and other members, and it's a checklist specifically for city farms and community gardens as you start thinking about reopening your space, or if you haven't actually closed, sort of bringing more people into your space. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand over to Amber, and then I'll be back and we're going to take some questions and do our best to answer as many of them for you as you can. Okay, so if I can get my PowerPoint to work. There we go. So all attendees, as you probably noticed, are muted with your videos off, so we can't actually see or hear you. Please do communicate with us though. So if you've got any questions at the end or just going through the presentation, please do use the Q&A function to send them in. I'm going to be monitoring them and I'll kind of collect them all together, and then we'll go through them towards the end. Also use that if you're having any kind of technical issue with Zoom. There is a chat function as well, so if you want to say hello to each other or share other ideas or links that are relevant to kind of what we're talking about, please do use that. I'll try and keep an eye on that as well, but if you've got a question for us, please use the Q&A function, just because then I'll definitely see it. We are recording this webinar and we'll put it online as soon as we can after the session. That's probably going to be next week now. So if there's anything you want to revisit, you'll be able to rewatch it, or if anybody couldn't make it, they can kind of watch it at a later date at your leisure with popcorn. If you get booted out of the webinar unintentionally, you'll be able to join. Just use the link that you were emailed. Okay, that is everything from me. So I'm going to take this down, and Amber, do you want to put up the start of your presentation?
Yeah. Hi everyone. I hope that you can see and hear me. I'm Amber Alfaroff. I work in London and been developing over the past 3 years a training programme in London, bringing together the city farms and community gardens here. And a lot of the learning from the checklist that I developed is from those organisations, as well as colleagues in Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. So here is an example of some of the trainees that I worked with back when we could stand a little bit closer together. And what we're going to be doing today is going through this checklist that I've created. And am I sharing my screen at the moment? Can you all see it? No, okay. So that, bear with me a moment and I'll just do that and then you can see who they are. This is actually the first time I've led a webinar. Okay, sharing the screen. So here's one of the groups that we train in London, who are a mix of city farmers and community gardeners. Thank you to all of you that wrote in and told us some of your concerns. So what we're going to do is have a look at some of those, and then I'll scroll through some of the headings on the checklist, and we can look at see if some of those have been addressed. We'll have a look at some of the opportunities towards the end of the call, and in the middle we'll have some examples of what some gardens have done. And if you want to put some examples in your chat, do. If you want to volunteer to share an example, that would be lovely. Please do, either by typing or we can put you on the speaker. So some of the concerns are generally management of community and volunteer activities, mitigating risk, lots of different user groups and how you can manage those on the site, cleaning, struggling with social distancing, hand washing. What do you do if somebody comes and coughs on site? How do you manage people? How do you ask people that might not understand how they can to do things you need them to do? Another one of the concerns was going into local lockdown again, or going into another national lockdown, and pounds and replacing income. So I think mostly we'll be looking at management of community and volunteer activities. The mitigating risk, we had a webinar yesterday, the recording should be out early next week, and that's got a lot about mitigating risk and putting in risk management procedures. The real focus of that was on how to demonstrate that you've thought things through. And I think most of you would have received a Word document I sent out earlier, which is it's a version of the checklist with everything else taken out, so that you can demonstrate, if you wanted to use it as a template, you can demonstrate against each of those headers what you've put in place or what you've thought about, to show you've thought things through, which is essentially the most important thing. The most important message here is that. In terms of pounds and replacing income, we can talk a little bit about what people have been doing, but perhaps we could do something else in the future that focuses a bit more on the next stage after reopening, when you really understand how much income you have, how much you've lost, how much you need to get. So if we have a look at the Social Farms and Gardens reopening checklist. Now, I don't want to talk too much, so Sophie's going to keep an eye on the chat. Sorry, we've got people who can't get on the webinar. I'll just forward this as well. There we go. Yeah, so I'll go through the checklist. If I'm talking too much, then Sophie's going to wave at me and say people have questions and raise those, so I'll see her do that. So essentially this is to work out whether you want to reopen your farm or garden at all. There's no obligation to do that at this stage, and you need to make sure things are safe before you do that. Yeah.
Just we're still seeing your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Switch it over. If you click the green share screen.
New share.
New share. There you go.
Thanks, Sophie. Okay. So here we go. Can you see that now? Yeah. Okay. So this is the reopening checklist. I expect most of you have had a look through that, which is why you're on the webinar. The introduction gives some of the wider things that you can reference. So this is very much a kind of introductory, everything you might want to think about. I'm sure it's missing a few things. For example, people delivering on site is something that's come to my attention in the past day, which isn't in here. You'll need to look at stuff for your local, regional, national legal commitments. Also your particular cohort of visitors, so for example older people, younger people, or people with extra needs. These are the categories. I thought alphabetically was good. You can just skim through it. Obviously animals won't be relevant to everybody, plants probably will. And you can look at the exact things that you need to hone in on, and really it's a series of questions to ask yourself. So it's we haven't offered any advice. We could probably offer some advice to direct questions, but actually it's very important that your own organisation think these things through, work out what's right for you. So with the animals, the advice is changing all the time. At the moment, there's no touching animals, for example, but nobody knows if animals themselves can spread coronavirus. So for some of the farms, for example, they need to be thinking about, can they double fence? Would they double fence? Should they double fence? And should they open if they can't? That's the sort of questions they'll be going through. So for example, Vauxhall City Farm can't double fence at all. Businesses, your relationship with businesses and your role as a business. So some of the grants and some of the finances that people have access to depend on whether they're a business or not. We know that charities kind of got slightly left by the wayside by some of the advice from the government in terms of, is it a business? A lot of you earn your own income and that's completely lost. Or is it entirely charitable and grant-based, which is looking surprisingly good at the moment if you're grant-based. A lot of people have had to continue delivering their services, even if nobody can access their sites. So for example, Core Landscapes in London have had to do that. and they've gone online for most of that. We'll be thinking about capacity. So what capacities do you actually have to open? The balance between staff on site, you might need more staff to help with social distancing. Do you have that staff? Can you afford to have that staff? Or can you afford to have volunteers managed that would need to do that? Going through care farms. Now, tell me, Sophie, am I waffling? What are people saying?
It's all quiet, so I think
is it all quiet?
Yeah, just taking it in. No, it's all good, Amber.
Okay. If you run a care farm, or if you work with people who the kind of care farm works with, so you'll need to get much more in-depth advice, and we have our care farm staff who can advise you on that, and there's a separate risk assessment checklist for care farms. Charitable aims, this is always worth coming back to. If you're not a charity, you'll have your own organisation or community group aims. So whatever you're planning, whatever changes you're planning, do they fit with your charitable aims? So for example, those groups that were able to deliver online, although they're a gardening organisation, they were able to fulfil those charitable aims because it was about contact with people and supporting people with mental health needs through gardening, and they were able to do that online. So whatever changes you might make, do check back with those aims, those memorandums and articles. Cleaning and hygiene. Now this is a big one, and we'll probably have some discussion about this and some questions coming through. The big questions that we've had really are around, who will clean, what will they clean, what might you ask other people to clean. So for example, one of the community gardens in King's Cross, Calthorpe Community Garden, they're letting people into the building if they need to go to the toilet, and then after the person's used the toilet, a member of staff goes in and cleans that toilet, and that's the way that they feel comfortable opening. Other people may not feel very comfortable with that, so I think that's quite a big question. Gloves, gardening gloves, can you supply those people that can't afford to bring their own? Will you ask people to bring them? How will they be washed between wears? Will you be asking people to have plastic gloves or not? Hand washing is fairly straightforward, I think, but there may be. I mean, I've got a feeling it might be worth applying for a grant for some nice stainless steel sinks. The city farms have the highest standard of hand washing care in terms of they've got to prevent E. coli, which is very, very dangerous disease, and their hand washing care is to prevent that. So soap, water, that blue towel, if that's something that you feel comfortable using in your organisation. I think quite a lot of the conversations people have been having about cleaning are about how that fits with an environmental organisation, and if you need to use different kinds of soap, stronger kinds of cleaning you just need to use bleach and water, but you need to kind of make sure that they're disposed of in the right way, and have conversations with your visitors and your staff and your volunteers about their feelings around those changes and their feelings around increased use of plastics. And it's also a good chance to communicate about those things. Tools, Sophie.
Sorry, Amber, to butt in.
Yeah.
Just because I was on the insurance session yesterday, so I think you're totally right that there is a lot of questions around hygiene, and the one really big thing that I took away from that session was that it's just really, there is no one answer here, and we're not unfortunately going to be able to give you a 1 to 10 list of this is how you sanitize your site. What it is really important to show is that you've gone through a process where you've looked at the risks that might be there for you, and then have sort of taken reasonable steps to sort of protect people on the site, and that's got to be the way that works right for your site. So potentially letting people wear masks, or just sort of working out what's best for you. But yeah, there is no one size fits all, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and there's a few links in this to kind of different ways of washing your hands as well. There's in terms of tools, that's quite interesting, because the advice that I've learned since writing this is to let the tools rest. There's a risk in terms of risk management. There's a risk to the person who is cleaning the tools. So you leave them to rest for, I think, 12 hours before the person comes and cleans them, before the next use. Yeah, toilets. We've got some draft guidance for reopening park toilets, which should be quite useful to people, from another organisation. So we can't claim that that's correct, but we've just signposted to that. If we want to have a conversation about this, we can have that just after I've been through these. Thinking exactly how you need to clean things. So fences, locks, taps, tools, clothing, indoor spaces. There's some example of a kind of risk assessment cleaning guidance document from Calthorpe Community Garden. And we've also got a couple of examples from Holborn Community Centre, who are just an almost entirely indoor organisation, and they're looking at how they clean different spaces and keep them clean, including pottery studios, small outdoor spaces where older people sit together, things like that. I think that's quite useful to see it from the first, from the horse's mouth. There's legal guidance about storing cleaning products safely. So although you might just put bleach under the sink in your house, you need to store it differently on a site, in a workplace. And I just put something in there about the Hygiene Bank. I don't know if you know the Hygiene Bank, but that's a food bank, but for people, which might be quite useful for visitors who can't afford toiletries, to signpost them to that. And communicating about cleaning, like I spoke about earlier, that would be, I think, potentially quite an interesting staff meeting, which I'm sure quite a lot of you have already had. Closing, and remember this is alphabetical, so closing for another lockdown, there may be another lockdown, or there may be local lockdowns, so you probably got a bit more warning about how to do that well this time than you did perhaps the last time during the first lockdown. So I think if you have the chance to talk through a procedure for that, and as part of that, I think it relates to GDPR and so on. If you are wanting to stay in touch with people, how will you keep their contact details? How will you keep their phone numbers? Do they want you to contact them by phone? You've got time now to work that out with the people that you are in touch with now. So if suddenly everybody does have to stay at home again, you might be a bit more of a head start than last time. And then there's also things like, if it's winter or summer, how will people come and look after the site? The other thing about another lockdown or deciding not to reopen, which you can see from the risk management procedures in yesterday's webinar, are the risks of having an empty site and not opening. So they speak quite a lot about that, and how you can mitigate those risks, and how some insurers have changed their insurance in the understanding that quite a lot of sites are much more empty than they used to be. And then there's also the fact you're an outdoor site, that needs to be communicated. So quite a lot of things to do with indoor sites won't apply to you. So yeah, communications, I think, probably is one of, from the people I spoke to, this is one of the very biggest parts of all this, is communicating really, really well with your staff, having a kind of open and transparent process where people can alert people to mistakes, or to things that need to happen, or to their concerns. So, thinking through how you'll communicate on site, how will you communicate with people who are hard of hearing when you're at a distance from them, how you'll communicate in person, how you'll communicate online, on the phone, to local media, to your funders and donors. So this is quite important, to show them what you've been doing, how that fulfills your charitable aims or your organisation's aims, and kind of as a lot of you will know, some local authority organisations or individuals may not quite understand the way that your business model works compared to more straightforward indoor charitable business models. And And there's also communication with people who come to your organisation in groups, like schools and doctors' surgeries. So, you know, how will you communicate with, for example, volunteers? If you decide that your site is too small for all your volunteers to come back, how will you communicate, or how will you decide which volunteers will come back? There's more of this under the people section. But what would you do? Would you choose the people who can come by public transport? If you're rural, there may not be the possibility of public transport. Do you have parking if you want people to come by cars? Is that something you support? If people come by foot or bike, are those the volunteers you'll prioritise, or will you prioritise those who have the greatest need? Whatever it is, you'll need a sort of transparent process to communicate to those volunteers that can't come for one reason or another, why they can't come yet, and how you're staying in touch with them if that's something you need to do as an organisation. An example, I'll give a couple of examples after I've gone through this. Yeah, communicating about cleaning, we've been through that. Signs and markers on sites, you know. I went to the park recently and there's a guy feeding the ducks bread just right in front of the sign that says, "Do not feed the ducks bread." People don't necessarily read signs. We've got some beautiful signs you can download from the site that were developed by our Scottish team, really nice cartoony signs about washing hands. I love the ones that somebody's wearing dungarees. But people do tend to ignore signs. So are there creative ways you can do this? Can this be part of what your organisation does for your beneficiaries, is creating new signs and walkways and things together, like this beautiful painted stone from Northern Ireland. And all those sort of signs and processes will help show that you have thought about and mitigated the risks that people have, including people that can't read, people that are bilingual, small children. And the other thing that seems to be quite an important thing to do is to have some kind of one-pager or booklet, or there's more imaginative ways to do it, but have something that tells people what they need to do. So for example, you're a regular learning disabled volunteer, either a booklet or a one-pager, or organisation St Mary's Secret Gardener, inviting them in one by one first, and then they give them a lesson on what they need to do. So how they should wear a mask, how they should wash their hands, how they should clean the toilet hygienically after they use it. And then after that, they can come in groups of 3. So there has to be some way that you've shown you've done your very best to get this information across. And I suppose that could be in a fun way. Internet and online, how can you communicate, and how can you retain some of those great things that have been achieved through this time, if you've had time to really up your online presence and to deliver things online, like quite a lot of people have been delivering gardening, indoor homegrown gardening workshops online. Is that something you can still afford the time to do or not? And is it something you'd like to grow or not? Is there funding you can get for that? Probably something. And in fact, every year in London, we have a London Harvest Festival, which attracts about 1,200 people to a site in South East London. And this year we're planning to do that online. So that should be fun. Ideas welcome. Commissioners, like I just spoke about, speaking to commissioners, showing, taking the time to put the commissioners and the council officers, doctors' surgeries, other organisations you work with in the picture, about how well you understand your clients and volunteers' needs and your visitors' needs. The fact you operate outdoors, so the social distancing will be potentially you can get a bit closer with less risk for a bit longer. I believe is what people are saying, but you'll need to check that. And communicating with funders, let them know what you've been doing, let them know what you are doing. A lot of funders are on Twitter and so on. But we did produce at the beginning of the lockdown some letters to funders, just really letting them know where there's where people had fallen through the gaps in terms of funding, and government grants and government loans. So we can share those with you if you want. Just send an email to amber@farmgarden.org.uk. And, you know, when you reopen, how will you let people know that you've reopened? What will you do? I'm gonna go through all this a bit quicker, because obviously you can read some of this, so we'll get on with a bit more chat. But, you know, food and drink, thinking about eating areas. Certainly city farms do tend to have one designated area for eating, and they're very strict about the rest. Who will be allowed in the kitchen? What are the rules? How will you open a cafe? If you have one, how will you communicate with people that want to open a cafe on your site because it's their business but you're not ready to open yet? How will you provide food and drink to people that you usually provide food and drink to, who, if you don't feel it's appropriate to have shared meals anymore? What will you do? I think people are going to be quite hungry or malnourished, some people, after this lockdown. How will you address that if you need to? And similarly, food banks, you know, how will you continue to work with any food banks or distribution agencies you have been working with? And how do you know you've got the capacity to do that? And how do you stop doing it in a good way if you know you haven't got the capacity to do that anymore? And then how are we going to deal with all this new engagement around food and local production? What should we do? I think we might have to do another webinar on that rather than address it right now. But there's a lot of opportunities. And you know, what food will you grow? What plants will you grow? Will anything change? Illness. A lot of this is again looking at government guidance, looking at human resources advice like the ACAS website and so on. We've got a few questions, Sophie. Should we anything to address right now? You're on mute.
We can go through them. I mean, I was sort of saving them up.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to sort of finish sort of skimming through just so people can see the content, and then if that sort of sparks like direct questions for people about their site, please send them in. I think it's really valuable to kind of for us to talk through a few questions, just because, you know, then it really helps people understand how it applies to like real life and real sites and real gardens and real goats. So, you know, if people do have, we talked about goats yesterday. If people do have specific questions about sort of the sites that you're working on, please send them in.
Yeah.
But carry on.
Okay, so yeah, illness in general, different kinds of illness. Insurance, we've got our lovely insurance webinar you can look at soon. Learning, what have we learned? Opportunities, what are they? People, so again, this is a lot about communication, but I've looked at the different categories of people. So staff, clients or supported volunteers. I welcome whatever you call that group of people or those individuals. I'm sure we can come up with a better name than those two. Volunteers in general, visitors and members of the public, trustees. I hope there's some trustees on the call. That's great if you are. Children, school groups, people's kids coming in. You need to think about safeguarding children and how you might reach out to local families, and then corporate groups, corporate volunteers, which are in London in particular, quite a big part of the income of gardens and farms towards the middle of London. So how you can sort of continue to communicate with them and keep those leads warm. Plants, how are your plants? Risk assessments. So we've given you a few examples of risk assessments. We've got the webinar about risk. We'll welcome any calls. The risk assessment document is a live document that can change, and people should kind of all be involved in developing that and putting their ideas in about what can mitigate risk. Safeguarding GDPR, spaces and social distancing. Now we could talk about this quite a lot on this call, but there'll be formal guidance from the government and from organisations like youth organisations and outdoor organisations that could change every week. So just check that and understand that as outdoor organisations, the risk is lower when you're actually outdoors. We believe, we're not sure. But sometimes you're indoors. Sometimes you're in a polytunnel or a shed. And sometimes you've planned your whole day indoors, but then you'll need to move out. The other way around, you planned your whole day outdoors and you'll need to move indoors. How can you mitigate against any problems with that? Got a list of key areas to think about, and then sort of transport and vehicles. And then we wish you luck. And like I said at the beginning of the webinar, I have just emailed around a Word version with these headers on it, which you might find to be a useful document to take notes on or to use for discussion. So let's go to some examples now. So we've got the opportunities which were mailed in. So creativity around interaction with visitors in the wake of the pandemic, huge increase in connections with nature, possibly more demand for your site, more footfall in the long run, interest in growing and cooking food, connecting with people in all sorts of ways, digitally and in different ways than you did before. So here's an example from Dean City Farm. Dean City Farm is opening on the 4th of July. It's quite a large site in southeast London, so it's kind of suburban rather than rural or urban. This is what they emailed round. So they sent an email to all their mailing list subscribers and gave everybody an invite to their site if they booked. So they emphasised that it was free. They asked people to book. They told them there's no toilets, the playgrounds aren't open, you can't touch the animals, there's a one-way system, but you are welcome with a ticketed system, which we'll find out if that works well. You can see they've got quite a lot of space at Dean. And then Freightliner City Farm is a much smaller city farm in Islington in London, so definitely urban, with a cafe that they run themselves, and they are definitely staying closed for a little bit longer to make sure that they have enough staff to manage the people that come through the gate. St Mary's Secret Garden I mentioned before. So this is a community garden in London, which has quite a lot of contracts from the local council for people with learning disabilities and people in recovery from mental illnesses and drug and alcohol. And they've had a lot of emails, they've had a lot of, or rather phone calls from people really keen to come back. So they're going to open a bit more formally soon, and they're kind of an outdoor venue. So they have a lot of, although they've got a gate, they've got a lot of people coming through who come and sit down on their site and make use of it. And they also have different organisations who use their site. So they are booking those groups in. So bump buddies, which are pregnant women, stroke survivors, Hackney dudes who are men over 50, and they've separated the groups into sixes. So people can't come in a group of 12. Hackney dudes came in as 18 or whatever, but now they've become 3 groups of 6 inside the venue. They have looked at the balance of having somebody back compared to what they'll be doing at home. And I think this is quite an important, really quite important thing to think about if you've got time to think about the individuals. So one of them, for example, has been bus hopping the whole time on and off buses during lockdown. So there's not much point in saying, oh, we can't take people that can't come by public transport. That only come by public transport. What am I saying? Some gardens aren't taking people who have to come by public transport, only people that can walk or cycle in. In this case, the guy is on buses all day, every day anyway. He might as well come to the garden where he's safer. And there's a similar and really rather distressing circumstances at Lambourne End, which is a very large adventure site in East London, where their cohort of young people are much safer coming to the farm than walking around on the streets. Quite a few of them have been attacked during this time as they've been walking around on the streets. So their risk assessment is that, you know, they're much safer on the site. They're young people as well. There's lower risk anyway. And St Mary's Secret Garden, back to them, they're the ones who are doing a lesson for people just to demonstrate that they've done everything that they can to help people feel safe and to make sure people understand sanitisation, social distancing as much as they can. And they've had the go-ahead from Adult Care that people can meet in threes. So people with learning disabilities can meet in threes on the site. And they're interested in occupational health and back to work assessments, which seems to be a bit of an issue, getting those independent assessments. I don't have the answer for that, but just so you know. Hammersmith Community Gardens Association, I'll just have a drink, are a multi-site site. So this is in a park, and then they've got another site which is attached to a school, and then they also do other work, which they're increasing. So they are increasing their work where they get little contracts with local councils within walking distance of their sites for like a large window box size planter. So they get paid for that, which is great. They get the contracts because they're a small local provider, and they spend a lot of time kind of charming local councils, and that also means that those people who are going to those sites will be socially distanced, because there's lots of kind of off the site. It's not all contained, and generally the way that they work is they get a lot of small grants, which I think is quite interesting. So they don't rely on any sort of big lottery grants or anything like that, and so they've got a lot more freedom over what they do, because their money isn't associated with particular programs. So they can carry on running the programs, and somehow that little having lots of small things going on works for them, both financially and in terms of garden spaces. I know most of you won't be in that situation, but it's quite a dynamic and interesting situation. And I think those are all the examples I've got, and that's my contact details there. So shall we go over to questions?
Sure. Okay.
Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Amber. There's so much in there. Yeah, there's the you know, if people haven't seen it yet, that toolkit is now available to download from the Social Farms and Gardens website. So it's a really useful document. Obviously, not everything in there will be applicable to every single group, but there will be stuff in there for every single group. So it's really worth sort of taking the time to sort of go through it and work out what are the kind of key factors for your organisation. I'm going to see if I can just add another person to our panel while we take questions. I know that we've got our colleague Heidi on the call somewhere, if I can find her.
There's 30 people on the call.
Oh, it's because she's already a panellist. And I'm just going to add her in. She's our operations manager. So just, I thought she might have some good stuff to kind of add in. There she is. And the other thing I just wanted to reflect on, Amber, when you were talking, I was thinking that actually working through that list, I think there are, and I know that there are some really difficult decisions to be made for people, and there's some really conflicting kind of motivations. I mean, one of the things that came out so strongly from the insurance and liability and risk assessment session that we ran yesterday was the fact that, you know, if you are running a site, you have ultimate responsibility for, you know, the well-being of people, and most of the time that is absolutely fine and not a problem, but there are serious consequences, you know, for individuals and for organizations if things go wrong. So I guess this pandemic is a really unpleasant reminder of that and how serious those can be. And I think that causes particular difficulties when we do have people that we work with who might not understand the need for like changes in the way we're doing things, or being asked to work in different ways and don't want to. And I know that there's a lot of groups out there who have had to ask certain volunteers to not attend at the moment, and that's really difficult for some of the reasons that Amber went through, you know, because you might know that they are, as individuals, really struggling, and that, you know, coming to your group is a big part of their routine. I'm trying to put together at the moment a session where we can talk a little bit more about that, and I know that some organisations have been doing quite a lot around kind of keeping in touch with volunteers, So we'll try and put a few more, maybe a webinar or some more resources together around that. And I just wanted to flag up really that I think we can see that there are those really difficult decisions to be made at the moment. And the other contradictory thing might be around, I guess, enforcing. So a lot of gardens are wonderful places for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons being that they're, you know, people can come and be themselves, and there's often like rules for, you know, for very good reason, but those rules are quite often light touch, and with the kind of risk that we're seeing at the moment, it might be really quite a culture change for your organization to be suddenly much more rigidly implementing and communicating rules that people actually just have to follow. So, you know, don't be aware of that, and don't be afraid to sort of discuss that as a group and work out actually how do you communicate that, and definitely have a plan for what do we do if these people don't, you know, if somebody doesn't follow the rules. I think it's always worth having that conversation up front. Anyway, I will shut up and I will go through the questions that we've had. Thank you. Please do send any more in if you've got them. The first one that came in was just around the tools resting, Amber, that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I've just heard this about giving the tools a rest. I quite like the idea of kind of them having a nice quiet lie down after being used. Essentially, it's to you know, the longer that they haven't been touched by say they've been touched by somebody with coronavirus, the longer that they've been left, the less chance there is of that spreading. Essentially, so people have like a clean table and a dirty table, and you leave the tools on the dirty table for as long as you can, and 12 hours being kind of the optimum amount of time. That's something to double check with an organisation like DEFRA or something, who will have, you know, a government organisation will have a very clear legal understanding of that. Heidi?
Just very quickly, I just know that charity shops, just normal charity shops, with the donations that they're taking in right now, they all have a policy of not putting them on the shop floor for 24 hours. So it might be 24 hours, I don't know, between 12 and 24. Obviously, I would say tools may be quicker to not have a problem with them, but
yeah.
It might also be a good idea to just, if you can set up a process where people, if you have enough tools where people always use the same tools, and so I know of groups who have, if they've got lots, you know, they'll give each volunteer their own wheelbarrow at the start of the day, and then, you know, they get, you know, that's got all the tools in it and the gloves that they need, and then that volunteer cleans that at the end of the day. So whether it's just a bucket of like, you know, bleach and water and disinfectant, but they're responsible for then, you know, cleaning that as well. It obviously depends on what kind of volunteers you're working with. There's loads of options with all of this. There's so many ways that you could do it, but it's just worth thinking through.
I've got a friend from a big family, and they had everything the same colour. So she was yellow. She had a yellow cup, yellow swimsuit, yellow toothbrush, yellow plate. She hates yellow now, but you can colour code them. So that's with the tools. And then the other thing, people are leaving tools in a bucket of you know, whatever's appropriate cleaning solution for them. Sophie?
Okay, thanks. So we talked about this yesterday, but somebody, and a lot of people out there work with animals. So someone's asked about whether there's set guidance about like washing hands before and after touching animals. And I can kind of bring in a little bit of what they said yesterday. So we had a solicitor.
Yeah, just before you do that, Sophie, no touching animals. No touching animals. That's the bottom line at the moment. So whatever we say now is about the next step.
Okay. The solicitor yesterday, so he was working from the health and safety executive, which might be different, and they've not released specific guidance, but he certainly said, you know, yes, use kind of common sense, and I mean, always be washing hands sort of after touching animals anyway, and also recommend if and when you do reintroduce that, you know, have gloves available as well. So yeah.
And there is some evidence that some animals actually can catch and maybe transmit coronavirus, ferrets in particular.
I'm just have to let you know that my cat is currently trying to rub her face on the webcam, so
Excellent.
very good timing.
Good timing.
Okay, moving on. So somebody's asked around the sort of number of people in sort of working groups. So is there guidance around the number of people that can work together, sort of very much following the sort of government guidance about the number of people that can meet at any one time?
That seems to be changing quite often, so be reluctant to give you a figure on that. But there's it depends on your cohort of people partly. At one point, might be 15 school children in groups of 6. I think ultimately groups of 6 or less is the current guidance. Although you can have more people on site at once, you can't have more than 6 people. So for example, say you've got 3 people and 3 carers, that's your group of 6. And then, St Mary's Secret Garden, for example, where people are learning disabled, they are only having people in groups of 3 just to be extra safe. But that does change all the time. So that will depend on the government guidance and also guidance from, for example, youth organisations or, older people's organisations.
I would also say check that it's different in different countries. So yeah. I think 6 is for England. It may be different in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, because that's, quite different rules and regulations. So you do need to check on the country you're in as well.
Yeah, certainly the solicitor yesterday was saying, sort of echoing that and saying that at the moment, there aren't any kind of concrete guidelines, but we should be looking to follow kind of government recommendations wherever possible. So yes, certainly if you're in England, then 6 people would be the safest way. And if anything was to happen, and you need to justify why you took certain actions, then you can show that you were clearly sort of following guidance in that way. Okay, I'm going to move on. So somebody's asked whether there are any suggestions about whether there's any training in terms of doing more things online for volunteers. So they have a tiny pot of money and they're looking for training in kind of presentations and basically the technical side of webinars. Is there any resources that you know of? For that, I'm certainly happy. I mean, I've only just learned webinars as well, but I'm certainly happy to talk through what I've learned over the last month, if that's useful.
Yeah, we could do a webinar on webinars.
Yeah, God.
I mean,
I'm not sure there is any particular. There are various funds that keep popping up saying, "Do you want to be doing things more online?" So I can't think of anything specifically aimed at that, and it'll be different in different places as well, whether it's just for London or England or Wales or whatever. So you do need to look out. But actually, based on our own experience within Social Farms and Gardens, we just did practice sessions before we started doing webinars, and I won't say we're perfect, but the more you do them, the better you get. So if you decide that that's something that you want to do, then you're going to have to put a little bit of money into a platform to support the webinar. But before you do it, just practice with your colleagues, with your volunteers, whoever wants to take part, because basically practice makes perfect.
And now's a really good time to give it a go. We've had a number of members. I mean, we were running our kind of Growing Together campaign. So if you sort of scroll down on our social media feeds, you'll see some examples there that we've shared from other members. But lots of people were just sort of having a go. I mean, we did a session with Pathways Care Farm a few weeks ago, and they had not done kind of YouTube broadcasts before. And he's virtually, well, not quite a YouTube star, but he was really surprised. Because his volunteers weren't able to come to site, he started putting videos together, just basically talking through what was happening on the farm and showing them, and that was really, really, really popular. That's the story that we've heard quite a lot during lockdown, particularly because people were missing sort of the outdoor spaces so much. So yeah, I'd really just sort of give it a go, and as Heidi said, sort of maybe have a practice session first. Yeah, I think, you know, increasingly, you know, we know that this isn't going away anytime soon. And so increasingly there will be more things moving online. So it's certainly something that we'll be looking at as an organisation, as like how much more training we can deliver. Ourselves, we are now, but we will be delivering more sort of online training and resources. And so I think one of those for us to take away will be, what can we then deliver about that? So leave that one with us.
That will be part of what I'll be doing in London as well, and that could be available to people outside London with pleasure. Just I'd say a couple of things about that as well is, don't worry too much about delivering live stuff, just stuff that's close. You know, if it's filmed close to the event, it still feels very warm. Live is a bit of a risk for various reasons. You know, goats jumping on you, or your internet conking out, cat. I mean, those are good things, but and then maybe approach your funder and see if they've got any specific training about or, you know, funds for digital.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm just attempting to read the questions and talk at the same time, which isn't going very well. So somebody's asked, I mean, and I really agree that our sector is often very difficult to categorise. So I think this person's just looking for a bit of reassurance that we are allowed to open.
Yes, you're allowed to open in England. I actually not sure about the other countries. Heidi might know a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Scotland they're now looking at doing some more opening. So I know somebody who's been working at the Royal Botanical Gardens. They're now going to be opening, and yeah, but it's up to. You do need to look and see whether, you know, because in Scotland, for instance, nobody was allowed to travel further than 5 miles, and same in Wales, which is still the case, I think. So yeah, it's just going to depend on the country.
Yeah, I mean, if you're open access, you know, you could, and the other people to consider is the local council and take their advice, and local social care and take their advice on your cohort, and you know, zoos and aquariums can open, so farms can open, but nobody's allowed to touch the animals yet.
No, there really isn't, like, it's not an open shut case at all. You know, from the survey that we did with members, we know that an awful lot of members actually didn't close at all, like, you know, during lockdown. Everybody changed the way they were working, and they might have closed entirely to the public, but the vast majority were still operating in some form, particularly those who are whose primary sort of function is as community food growers. So they were certainly, you know, key workers and were working throughout lockdown. So yeah, for many people, it's not about sort of open or closed. It's sort of, you know, a change in working practices, and a change, you know, sort of moving forward, and will continue to change. But yeah, certainly there is, you know, there's nothing to say that you shouldn't be reopening now. But what is important is that you can demonstrate that you have, you know, addressed the risks safely, and spent some time thinking through them.
I think also a number of people were open through the initial lockdown, but they weren't really having any volunteers. So if there were some key people that maybe they themselves were volunteers looking after the site, or they were staff members, but they weren't having a lot of volunteers. And I think that's kind of the issue. Like, if you're going to have more of your community and volunteers coming in, that's when you really need to start thinking about how you're going to manage all that.
Yeah, and in terms of, you know, one of the biggest decisions about reopening for sites that do have an income to, you know, that they need to support their site is, can you afford to pay enough staff to manage the amount of people coming in, or you know, can you afford to have enough well-trained volunteers to manage that process? And if not, it may not be a good idea to open yet.
Okay. Amber, just a really quick one. Would you be able to circulate the guidance around not being able to touch animals? Somebody just wanted to have a look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And there's a couple of people talking about Scottish guidance. Now, none of us three are part of the Scottish team, I'm afraid. We try and make the webinars sort of country-wide, UK-wide. But if there are specific bits of Scottish guidance, please contact our Scotland team. If you don't have the details, just yeah, message one of us and we'll sort of pass you on, and they'll be able to kind of advise you on that.
On that guidance that the Scottish Government wrote, we advised the Scottish Government.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
So that is our Scottish team that helped write that. So yeah, do get in touch with them.
Okay, great. And then you know, we talked a little bit about you know, the ways of communicating the requirements to people, and I know that we mentioned that we've produced, or the Scottish team have produced some signs. Have either of you seen any other kind of examples of like pictograms, so that would help people with communication issues or language barriers kind of get that message across?
I have, yeah. There's a really great one from Spitalfield City Farm, which is a photo of them keeping a donkey width apart, a donkey length apart.
I know that Diane, who works with us, our colleague, she shared a picture of a scarecrow that a garden had built with extra long arms that were 2 meters apart, as a sort of a physical reminder of what 2 meters was. One of the other things, this isn't kind of pictorial, but I know one of the groups that took part in one of our other webinars, when they had kind of refreshed training, what they also did was they asked their volunteers to sign a document to say that they had received and understood that training, and that's just a really helpful way of having evidence, basically, that you have taken every reasonable step to reduce that risk and you have delivered that training. Yeah, just wanted to flag that.
But yeah, the example of the painted stones, you know, having way markers, making use of natural materials on the site.
Right, okay, I think we've worked through all the questions, which is great. So I'm just going to throw my slides back up, if that's okay. Okay. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we do have another webinar coming up on similar themes to this, and this one will be specifically for care farm members. So that's being run by our Growing Care Farming team. So that's on the 14th of July. So that's that. And then, you know, a lot of these issues that we're talking about today, as I sort of said, there's no one answer, and talking to each other about it really helps, and really helps to hear what other people are doing. So if you're not already, I'd really recommend joining our Social Farms and Gardens group, where there's a lot of members on there, and if you have specific questions, I think it's really worth just throwing them up there. And we've had a lot of sort of helpful advice, guidance, tips from the membership, so please do join that. Okay, so our social media and stuff is on there, and we try and sort of throw out as much as we can that's useful, so if you're not, please do follow us. Unless there's anything that, Amber, you want to add before we close, I think we're nearly there.
Yeah, I could add a couple of things about how much the farms and gardens mean to people, and how well they, you know your organisations really well, and you know your cohort of people really well, and also the historically the level of hygiene and understanding of people's needs is very, very high in these gardens. The focus on mental and physical health is also, very, very high in the gardens and farms, and well-being in general. And I think there's quite a bright future, and I think working together is going to be a really important part of that. As people perhaps travel less, as people discover the natural areas in their local area are very, very close to their hearts and very important, your farms and gardens will be part of those people's lives in a bigger way. and I think it's really important to stay in touch. In London, I'm got particular funding to help our groups in London adapt to coronavirus. So I'll be putting on training, and love to hear your ideas about what you'd like in terms of that, and your suggestions. You know, it's an asset-based thing, so we want to know what you can offer to other people to help them think through this, or what great ideas that you have to share. We've heard some brilliant ones already. We'd like to hear many, many more. And also where you think all this is going to go. What, being optimistic, what can we all achieve together in a big way? So you can email me, amber@farmgarden.org.uk, and look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you. And kind of on a similar note, if anybody has particular subjects that they'd like to see covered in future webinars, I'd be really interested to hear from you. Or if you're doing things in your group that are working particularly well and you'd be interested in sharing that, then I'd be happy to kind of look to facilitate a webinar around that, because it's just really great for us to be able to use this platform for everyone to learn from each other. Right. Thank you very much, Amber, for all your work and time today, and Heidi for joining us. And thank you, everyone that has joined the webinar. I'm going to close it as soon as I can find the button.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.